I had the words in my mouth, and I could feel them like something sharp I shouldn't swallow. They sat behind my teeth, pressing forward every time I inhaled, every time the room went briefly still, every time someone paused as if waiting for the right sentence to arrive. I kept telling myself I was only thinking too loudly, that it was just nerves, that I was tired, that fear makes you imagine dangers that aren't there. But it wasn't imagination. It was recognition. There's a difference between panic and knowing. Panic is noisy. Knowing is quiet. Knowing arrives without drama and settles in your chest like a weight you don't remember picking up. It makes ordinary sounds feel too clear. The scrape of a chair leg, the soft paper of a document being moved, the dry click when a pen cap is sealed again. The world keeps functioning, and that's what makes it unbearable. Everything continues as if nothing is about to break. I watched people speak with easy certainty, and it made something in me tighten. I watched their mouths move and their eyes shift to each other for approval. I watched them laugh once, only a small laugh, the kind meant to prove you weren't afraid. I remember the laugh more than I should. It didn't fit. It sounded like someone tapping a glass to see if it was cracked. I knew what I was supposed to do in that moment, not because anyone told me, not because there was a rule written down somewhere, just because I was close enough to the edge to feel the drop. I tried to turn it into something else, a minor concern, a small detail, a question I could ask harmlessly, dressed up as curiosity. If I could make it sound like I was only clarifying, only being thorough, maybe it would be safe. Maybe it wouldn't be seen as doubt. Maybe it wouldn't be seen as what it was. Because doubt is never just doubt. Doubt is an accusation. Doubt implies someone else is wrong. Doubt implies someone else didn't see what you saw. And the people who believe they are steering history do not like being told there is fog in front of them. My hands did not know what to do. I kept them busy so they wouldn't betray me. I smoothed something that didn't need smoothing. I adjusted something that was already straight. I ran my thumb along the edge of paper until it began to fray, until the texture changed under my skin and gave me something to focus on besides my own thoughts. I remember swallowing once, hard, and realizing my throat had gone dry. My heart wasn't racing. That would have been simpler. Racing would have meant I was afraid of a moment. But this was slower than fear. This was the steady awareness that a door was closing. And once it latched, it would not open again no matter how loud you screamed on the other side. I kept looking for someone else to say it first. That's the most humiliating part. How quickly you begin to hope for rescue. You sit inside your silence and wait for another voice to do the work you're afraid to do. You scan faces. You listen for a change in tone. You watch for a hand that hesitates before signing, a gaze that lingers too long on the wrong detail. Anything that would mean you weren't alone in what you saw. But everyone looked forward. Everyone kept moving. And the more smoothly things moved, the more impossible it felt to interrupt. The momentum became its own authority. The room had a rhythm, and to break it would be to announce yourself as a problem, not a person, a disruption, a source of delay, a weakness. I could already feel the consequence of speaking before I ever spoke. Not punishment, not shouting. Something colder than that. The quiet shift, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the way a room can change temperature when you stop being useful, the way people remember your name afterward for the wrong reason. I told myself I could bring it up later, in a quieter moment, in the corridor, in private. I told myself I could phrase it better when I had time. I told myself I didn't yet have enough certainty to justify the risk. These were all clean thoughts, reasonable thoughts, thoughts that would look respectable on paper. But underneath them was the truth I didn't want to admit. I was afraid of being seen as disloyal, seen as alarmist, seen as someone who didn't understand his place. Because there is a kind of fear that doesn't come from danger at all. It comes from the stare of other men when you step out of line. It comes from the sudden awareness that everyone around you knows how to survive here, and you might be the only one stupid enough to break the rules out loud. The words rose again. I felt them press up, urgent now, not panicked, just insisting, like a hand on your arm, stopping you before you step into a street. All it would have taken was a breath and a sound. Instead, I took the breath and held it. I lowered my eyes as if studying something important. I let the moment pass, and in that passing, I understood with a strange calm that I had already chosen. The first details came the way they always did in those days. Quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as ordinary work. There was a room that never belonged to the men inside it. You could feel that as soon as you stepped through the doorway. The air carried old heat and stale smoke, the kind that clung to wool and paper, and stayed long after the last cigarette was pinched out. Lamps burned even when daylight existed somewhere outside, and their light didn't brighten anything so much as flatten it, turn faces into masks, turn maps into pale skin stretched across tables. Nothing in that place was chaotic. That was part of the trap. The chairs were placed with intention. The documents were stacked with corners aligned. The pencils sat where they were meant to sit. Even silence had a shape there. It fell into predictable gaps between sentences, and everyone understood what those gaps meant. When someone stopped speaking, you didn't fill the space. You waited. You let the weight settle. You let the right voice decide when the room could breathe again. There were men who spoke as if their words were the room itself, like sound was something they owned. Others spoke only when asked, and even then with careful restraint, as if every syllable cost them something. Most did not speak at all unless necessary, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned what speech could do to you. It wasn't a lesson taught openly. It was absorbed, the way a young dog learns not to step on a master's foot after the first sharp correction. The way you learn the boundaries of power by brushing against them once and feeling how solid they are. I wasn't new, but I wasn't important either. That is a specific kind of existence, being close enough to hear what matters, but far enough down the line that your presence feels interchangeable. You learn to make yourself useful without becoming visible. You learn to anticipate what will be needed before it is demanded. You learn to listen without looking like you are listening. Most of all, you learn that hierarchy is not just titles and insignia. It's posture. It's timing. It's who speaks without turning their head, and who must stand to be heard at all. It's who can interrupt and who cannot, who can be wrong and remain untouchable, who must be correct simply to remain. Outside that room, life continued in fragments. Corridors, stairwells, vehicles idling in the cold, boots scraping stone. Men moved with purpose because purpose was expected. You didn't need to know the full picture to know your part. If anything, not knowing was a kind of protection. Ignorance could be claimed. Confusion could be forgiven. But knowing and speaking, that was a decision you owned forever. Each day began with orders that sounded like statements of fact. They arrived already shaped, already approved, and the people receiving them treated them the way you treat weather. You adapt, you prepare, you endure. No one argued with the sky. There were briefings that felt less like conversations and more like performances. A man would lay out information with the smooth certainty of someone presenting a finished object. Another would nod, not necessarily in agreement, but in recognition of procedure. Hands would move, papers would pass, a line would be drawn on a map, a schedule adjusted, a column of numbers rewritten. Then someone would say something that carried a final note, subtle, almost polite, and everyone would understand that the discussion was over. It was not that mistakes didn't exist. They did, but they were handled like inconveniences, not warnings. A delay, a misread signal, an inaccurate report. You corrected the surface and moved forward. The deeper you looked, the more dangerous you became, and there was always the unspoken pressure to keep moving. Movement was safety. Momentum was survival. If you slowed things down, if you questioned too hard, you weren't protecting anyone. You were creating friction. You were challenging the competence of people who could ruin you without raising their voices. You were asking the room to admit uncertainty, and uncertainty, in that place, was treated like infection. I watched how men protected themselves. Some did it with arrogance, speaking quickly and confidently, leaving no opening for response. Some did it with silence, letting others fill the air while they stayed clean of blame. Some did it with humor, a brief remark, a thin smile, just enough to show they were calm, just enough to make fear look childish. And some did it by becoming perfect instruments. They executed tasks with such precise obedience that no one could accuse them of thinking. They turned themselves into hands, into eyes, into voices that repeated what was given. There is a comfort in being an instrument. Instruments aren't judged for what they feel. I tried to be that. I told myself it was discipline. I told myself it was professionalism. I told myself that in a system like this, the only sane way to survive was to be useful and quiet. But there were moments, small, almost accidental moments, when the structure revealed itself more clearly than any speech could. A man would hesitate before entering the room, as if taking one last breath of freedom in the corridor. A messenger would deliver a paper and keep his gaze fixed on the floor, like eye contact was a risk. Someone would correct themselves mid-sentence, choosing a safer word, a softer phrase, because language here was not about truth. It was about positioning. Once, I saw someone ask a question in the wrong tone. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a simple request for clarification, but the room responded the way a body responds to pain. Instantly, defensively. The question hung there for a moment, exposed. Not because it was foolish, but because it suggested there might be something not already controlled. The answer came, measured and cold. The kind of answer that doesn't just address the question, but marks the person who asked it. No one said anything after that. Not for several seconds. And in those seconds, every man present learned the same lesson again. There are costs for stepping outside your role. That's what made speaking feel dangerous. Not the threat of open punishment, but the certainty of subtle consequences. Being moved aside, being excluded, being seen as unreliable, being given smaller tasks, less access, less trust. A career doesn't have to end loudly to end completely. I carried these observations like stones in my pocket. They made me walk differently, because when you live inside a machine, you begin to fear becoming the part that squeaks. You begin to measure every impulse against the risk of being noticed. Even your conscience starts to negotiate with your survival. And in that place, conscience was never celebrated. It was tolerated only when it remained invisible. So the world narrowed. It became a series of controlled motions and careful responses. I learned when to speak, how much, and to whom. I learned when to lower my eyes, when to nod, when to pretend I hadn't heard something that shouldn't have been said out loud. Above all, I learned that the most powerful force in that room wasn't authority. It was the shared understanding that certain words must never be spoken, especially by someone like me. And once you understand that, you begin to feel the true weight of silence. It isn't empty. It is enforced. It is maintained. It is expected. There were days when the thought came to me fully formed, without warning, as if it had been waiting for a moment when my guard was down. It didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as clarity. I would be standing still, listening, watching, recording details the way I always did. And suddenly I would see the shape of things the way you see a flaw in glass only when the light hits it at the wrong angle. Not a theory, not speculation. A pattern that didn't belong. Once seen, it refused to disappear. I tried to treat it like a private irritation, something to manage internally. I told myself that many men must have thoughts like this and simply learn to live with them. That restraint was part of maturity. That discipline meant knowing when not to speak. But the thought kept returning, patient and unyielding. It followed me into quiet moments, into the pauses between tasks, into the dull hours when nothing demanded my attention, and my mind was free to wander where it shouldn't. I would replay fragments of conversations, re-examine gestures that had seemed insignificant at the time, a phrase delivered too confidently, an assumption left untested, a decision treated as inevitable simply because it had already been spoken aloud. The more I examined it, the more the feeling changed. At first it was unease, then discomfort, then something closer to responsibility. That was when it became dangerous. Responsibility is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It sits beside you and waits. It asks questions without raising its voice. And those questions are simple in the most brutal way. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? I began to imagine the act of speaking with an intensity that frightened me. I pictured the moment unfolding again and again, each time slightly different. Sometimes I imagined my voice steady, controlled, almost casual. I would frame it as a concern, not an accusation. I would use neutral language. I would acknowledge the authority in the room before offering my observation. I would make it clear I understood my position. In other versions, my voice betrayed me. It tightened. It cracked. I said too much, too quickly. The room turned before I had finished my sentence. Faces hardened. The temperature dropped. I imagined the silence afterward. That silence was always worse than shouting. In my mind, the response was rarely overt hostility. It was polite dismissal. Brief explanation delivered with patience as if to a child. A reminder of considerations I had not been privy to. A reassurance that everything had already been accounted for. And then the look. The look that tells you your usefulness has just been reassessed. I told myself that even if I spoke perfectly, the outcome would be the same. That the decision was already set. That nothing I said would truly change its course. This thought brought temporary relief, because it absolved me of responsibility. If speech was futile, silence was reasonable. But the relief never lasted, because beneath that reasoning was another truth I tried not to touch. Speaking was never only about changing the outcome. It was about refusing to be complicit in what I could already see forming. And that thought carried a heavier weight than fear. There were moments when my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A tightening in my chest when a particular assumption was repeated. A heat behind my eyes when a detail was brushed aside too easily. Once, my mouth actually opened, just slightly, before I caught myself and looked down at the table as if searching for confirmation in the grain of the wood. I learned to recognize those moments and suppress them. I adjusted my breathing. I pressed my tongue against my teeth. I reminded myself of the rules that were never written down, but always obeyed. I reminded myself that people who survived here did so by understanding the limits of their voice. I thought about what would happen afterward. Not immediately, not in the room. Later, I imagined my name appearing in conversations I would never hear. I imagined doors closing quietly. I imagined being reassigned, overlooked, no longer invited into rooms where things were decided. I imagined the slow erosion of trust, the kind that leaves no evidence but is impossible to reverse. There was also a deeper fear, one I rarely allowed myself to articulate. What if I was wrong? What if my certainty was arrogance dressed up as conscience? What if I misunderstood something essential, something known only to those higher above? To speak would be to expose not only dissent, but ignorance. And ignorance, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. The system thrived on the idea that someone, somewhere, understood the full picture. Believing that made obedience feel rational. To question that belief was to step into a void where no one could guarantee safety. I clung to the idea that restraint was wisdom, that patience was a form of intelligence, that silence could be virtuous. And yet, the thought would not stop asking its questions. At night, when exhaustion stripped away my defenses, I would imagine the future, not in vivid scenes, but in impressions. A heaviness settling over everything. The knowledge that something had gone wrong in exactly the way I had feared. The awareness that I had recognized it early enough to say something, and chosen not to. I would push the thought away before it could complete itself. I told myself it was morbid, that speculation was useless, that thinking ahead like that served no one. Still, the internal debate continued, relentless and circular. One side of me argued for survival. It spoke in measured tones, listing risks, reminding me of my insignificance, insisting that systems larger than any individual could not be altered by a single voice. It promised safety in conformity. The other side did not argue. It merely observed. It pointed out that fear had already begun to shape my behavior, that my silence was not neutral, that every moment I waited made the choice easier and the consequences heavier. I lived suspended between these two selves. Outwardly, I remained composed. I fulfilled my role. I responded when addressed. I offered information that was requested and nothing more. I became, in appearance, exactly what was expected of me. Inwardly, something eroded. The space between thought and action grew wider, more strained. Each time I chose not to speak, the silence felt less like a decision and more like a habit forming. I worried, not that I would speak too soon, but that soon I would no longer feel the urge to speak at all. That frightened me more than punishment ever could, because the moment conscience stops knocking, you are no longer choosing silence. You have become it. And as the days pressed forward, as conversations hardened into conclusions, I could feel the narrowing of possibility. The chance to intervene was not disappearing in a dramatic way. It was fading quietly, like a sound receding down a long corridor. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I told myself I would know when it came. But even as I believed that, Another part of me understood something I did not want to face yet. The longer I waited, the more the decision was being made for me. The moment arrived without ceremony. No pause announced it. No silence opened space for reconsideration. It came the way things often did there, mid-sentence, mid-motion, wrapped in the familiarity of procedure. A voice spoke with finality not because it was raised, but because it did not expect resistance. The words moved forward and carried everyone with them. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening low in my stomach, a sudden awareness of my own posture, as if my body had decided something before my mind could intervene. I knew with an unsettling precision that this was it, not the last chance in some dramatic sense, but the last moment where interruption would still be interruption, not defiance. Someone finished speaking. Another nodded. A hand moved across the table and traced a line that did not belong there. It was done casually, almost absent-mindedly, the kind of motion you make when you are confident the surface beneath you is solid. That line cut through everything I had been holding back. My thoughts did not race, they aligned. I saw the flaw as clearly as if it had been outlined for me alone. I understood what would follow, not in detail, not in images, but in weight. A sequence that could no longer be altered once it began moving. The inevitability of momentum once set in motion. The room felt smaller. I remember the sound of my own breathing, suddenly too loud in my ears. I remember the urge to clear my throat and the way my muscles tensed as if preparing to stand. It was instinctive, physical, the body recognizing a moment before the mind gives permission. My mouth opened, only slightly, enough for air to move in, enough for words to exist as potential. In that fraction of a second, everything balanced. I could see how easily it could tip one way or the other, how fragile the moment truly was. A breath, a sound, and the entire rhythm of the room would break. Heads would turn, attention would sharpen, the machinery would pause, if only briefly. I imagined the sentence forming, not polished, not perfect, but honest. I imagined the discomfort it would cause, the irritation, the surprise. I imagined the risk settling onto me like a mark I would never fully erase. And then I imagined the aftermath. Not the immediate response, but what came after. The quiet recalibration, the subtle reassignment of trust, the way my presence in future rooms would be weighed differently, the way my voice, once used, could never be unheard. The thought was not dramatic. It was practical, and practicality won. I felt my jaw tighten, my tongue pressed back against the roof of my mouth. The words retreated, not forcefully, but obediently, like something trained to know when it was no longer welcome. I lowered my eyes. It was a small movement, almost invisible. No one noticed it. No one needed to. In that environment, the absence of interruption was confirmation enough. Someone else spoke. The moment passed cleanly, seamlessly, absorbed into the flow of decisions. Papers shifted. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The line that had been drawn remained. I became acutely aware of my hands. They were still, too still, resting where they had been as if frozen there. I felt a faint tingling in my fingers, the after effect of a choice made and held. It was the same sensation you get when you stop yourself from touching something hot. Relief mixed with a delayed awareness of what you almost did. No one looked at me. That, more than anything, told me it was over. The room continued as if nothing had occurred, and in a sense, nothing had. No objection had been raised. No delay introduced. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to, but something had shifted irreversibly. I felt it settle into me, heavy and unmistakable. Not guilt yet, not regret. Something colder. A recognition that I had crossed a threshold without moving an inch. There would be no second chance to speak in this way. The decision was no longer forming. It was formed. Any future words would arrive too late, stripped of urgency, transformed into commentary rather than warning. Silence had done its work. As the discussion moved on, I focused on the smallest details to keep myself anchored. The texture of the table beneath my palms, the faint hum of electricity in the lamps, the controlled cadence of voices continuing their work. Outwardly, I was unchanged. Inwardly, I knew with quiet certainty that I had just backed down. And once that happens, there is no way to pretend you didn't. The confirmation did not arrive all at once. It never does. At first, there was only a faint shift in the air, an unease that couldn't be traced to any single cause. The days continued with their usual rhythm. Orders were issued, movements recorded, messages passed along channels that had existed long before me and would continue long after. On the surface, nothing appeared broken. That was the cruelest part. If the consequence had announced itself immediately, if something had failed outright, if there had been noise or visible collapse, I might have found a way to distance myself from it. I might have told myself that events were chaotic, that no one could have known. Sudden disaster leaves little room for private guilt. But this was different. This unfolded slowly, methodically, exactly as systems prefer. Small adjustments began to appear, nothing alarming on its own. A schedule altered. A report revised to remove an uncertainty that now felt inconvenient. A phrase repeated often enough that it hardened into accepted truth. Each change made sense when examined in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized with a sickening familiarity. It was the same shape I had seen before, only now it was moving. I remember the first time I realized my fear was becoming reality. It wasn't during a dramatic moment. It was during something mundane, an exchange of information that passed too easily, too smoothly. A piece of data that should have slowed things down was acknowledged and then set aside, not rejected, not debated, simply absorbed and neutralized. I felt the recognition like a pressure behind my eyes. There it is. I told myself not to overreact. That patterns always look clearer in retrospect, that I was projecting my earlier anxiety onto neutral developments. This was another rationalization, and I knew it even as I relied on it. Rationalization becomes more elegant the more desperately you need it. As time passed, the signs multiplied. People stopped asking certain questions. Conversations narrowed. The language used to describe what was happening became more confident, more absolute. Possibility was replaced by certainty, and certainty, once established, has a way of protecting itself. I watched men adjust their understanding to fit the direction things were taking. They didn't do it dishonestly. They did it instinctively. No one wants to believe they are walking toward harm. It is far easier to reshape your perception than to confront the idea that you are complicit in something dangerous. I recognized this too, because I was doing the same thing. Each day that passed without immediate consequence made my silence feel more defensible. If nothing had gone wrong yet, then perhaps nothing would. Perhaps the risk I had seen would be mitigated by factors I hadn't considered. Perhaps the system would correct itself. This hope was quiet and persistent, and then it began to fail. The first undeniable confirmation arrived indirectly. A message delivered with an unfamiliar tone. A delay explained away with a phrase that didn't quite convince. A detail that no longer aligned with the assumptions everyone was operating under. It was subtle, but it carried weight. I felt it settle in my chest like a stone. From that point on, it became harder to lie to myself. The developments no longer required interpretation. They followed the path I had feared with unsettling precision. Each step reinforced the next. Momentum, once harmless, became something else, something with direction and force. I remember standing alone at one point, staring at a wall covered in markings that had once felt abstract. Lines, symbols, numbers. They no longer felt theoretical. They felt like commitments, like promises that could not be unmade. I thought about the moment I had stayed silent. I thought about how easily it could have gone differently. The mind is merciless in this way. It reconstructs the past with cruel clarity. It shows you not what you did, but what you could have done with almost no effort at all. A sentence, a gesture, a hesitation made visible instead of hidden. I began to understand the true cost of silence. It wasn't just the outcome itself, though that was bad enough. It was the knowledge that the outcome carried my fingerprint, however faint. I had not caused it. I had not ordered it, but I had allowed it to proceed without resistance. And allowance is not neutrality. As the situation worsened, reactions followed predictable paths. Explanations were offered. Responsibility diffused upward and outward, spread thin enough that no one person seemed to hold it. The system adjusted its language again, reframing events in a way that preserved competence and authority. I listened to these explanations with a strange detachment. They did not surprise me. What surprised me was how little room there was for grief. Not public grief. That would come later in controlled forms. What I mean is the absence of space to acknowledge loss honestly. Everything was managed, contained, processed. There was no moment where someone stopped and simply admitted that something irreversible had occurred because of a choice that should have been questioned. That admission would have required looking backward. Backward was forbidden. I felt increasingly isolated, even among others. Conversations continued, but they moved around the truth instead of through it. I found myself listening for words that never came, waiting for someone, anyone, to say what I had not said earlier. No one did. And I understood why. To speak now would be to confess not only error, but delay. It would be to ask why the warning had not been voiced when it still mattered. It would be to invite scrutiny of moments best left untouched, including mine. The consequences expanded beyond the immediate situation. Trust eroded in quiet ways. Confidence was maintained publicly, but faltered in private exchanges. Decisions became more rigid, not less, as if firmness could compensate for what had already been lost. I felt a constant tension in my body, a readiness that had nowhere to go. The urge to act had arrived too late, and now had no outlet. It turned inward instead, manifesting as restlessness, irritability, exhaustion. Sleep became difficult. When I did sleep, I dreamed in fragments, not of events themselves, but of interruptions that never happened. I would dream of standing up, of clearing my throat, of speaking, and wake just before the words left my mouth. The relief of waking was immediately replaced by the familiar weight of reality. I began to avoid certain spaces, certain discussions, not because I was afraid of what I would hear, but because I already knew. The confirmation was complete. There was nothing left to discover. What remained was endurance, living with the knowledge that the future I had feared had arrived quietly, without spectacle, and that my silence had smoothed its path. I watched others adapt, justify, move forward. I did the same outwardly, but inwardly something had settled that would not move. A realization that consequences do not always announce themselves as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as understanding, and understanding once gained cannot be undone. Time did not soften it. That was the first thing I learned once distance finally existed. Real distance, measured not in days or assignments, but in years and silence. The event receded into history, filed away under official language and institutional memory. New routines replaced old ones. New faces filled rooms I no longer entered. The world proved, as it always does, that it can continue. But the moment I backed down did not move. It stayed exactly where it had been, preserved with a clarity that surprised me. Other memories blurred at the edges. Dates slipped. Voices merged. But that instant remained intact, untouched by time. I could return to it without effort, as if my mind had marked it as something essential, something that must never be misplaced. I would be doing something ordinary, standing still, waiting, listening to nothing in particular, and suddenly I would feel it again, the tightening, the held breath, the precise awareness of choice. I did not need reminders. The world provided none. No one accused me. No one asked what I had known or when I had known it. There were no confrontations, no reckoning scenes, no moments of public exposure. History does not interrogate the silent. That absence became its own burden, because without accusation, there is no defense to prepare. Without judgment, there is nothing to argue against. The silence around my silence gave it permanence. It made it personal. I tried at times to contextualize it, to frame it as the product of circumstance, of youth, of a system designed to suppress individual voice. These explanations were not lies. They were accurate. They were also insufficient. They explained why I stayed silent. They did not erase the fact that I did. What lingered was not guilt in the dramatic sense, not anguish, not self-punishment. It was something quieter and more corrosive, a steady awareness that there had been a version of myself who stood up in that moment, and that I had chosen not to become him. That knowledge altered the way I saw everything afterward. When people spoke confidently about principles, I listened differently. When someone insisted they would act if things ever went too far, I felt an uncomfortable familiarity. I recognized the certainty. I knew how easily it could dissolve under pressure. I recognized it because it had dissolved in me. There were moments when I wondered whether silence had become a habit that extended beyond that one decision, whether the choice I made then had quietly shaped others that followed. Not always in situations of consequence, sometimes in small, almost invisible ways. A thought withheld, a correction unoffered, a discomfort ignored. I could not prove this to myself. That uncertainty troubled me more than certainty ever could, because it suggested that silence, once chosen, does not remain contained. It seeps. It teaches you what you are capable of enduring and what you are capable of avoiding. I did not become cruel. I did not become indifferent, but something in me recalibrated. I became more cautious, more attuned to risk, more willing to let things pass unchallenged if challenging them threatened stability. From the outside, this looked like maturity. From the inside, it felt like accommodation. Occasionally, I would try to imagine speaking now, not as correction, not as warning, but as confession, to say out loud that I had known something was wrong and had remained silent. I imagined how that might feel, whether it would bring relief or merely reshape the weight into something new. I never did it, not because I feared consequences. There were none left to fear, but because words spoken too late do not restore anything. They only rearrange memory, and memory had already arranged itself around that moment. I learned to live with it the way you live with a scar that never quite stops aching. You stop expecting it to heal. You stop explaining it. You simply adjust the way you move so you don't disturb it unnecessarily. But there are times, quiet times, unguarded times, when it makes itself known, when I catch myself hesitating before speaking, even now, when I feel the old calculation begin automatically. Is this worth the cost? In those moments, I understand something I didn't then. The decision was never only about that room, or that order, or that consequence. It was about the boundary I discovered within myself, the point where fear outweighed responsibility, the place where silence became easier than warning. That boundary has never moved. And the most lasting consequence of that day is not what happened afterward. It is the knowledge that, when it mattered most, I learned exactly who I was willing to be and who I was not.